Et voila. Right, greetings, hello, welcome to the Philosophy Club. Bienvenue au Club de Philosophie. Cette fois, c'est dimanche encore, and today is the 16th of June, 2024. And today I've been learning the Nepali calendar, because I've been working on the Nepali language, which is absolutely fascinating. Going deeply into Nepali history, it's where Buddha was born. And so I've been getting the days, months of the year in Nepali. This is Jestha in the Nepali calendar. And we just had Vesak, which is the start of the year, spring. So we're in the second month. And I'll come back to that a bit later, about Nepal. Interesting stuff. And it's where Mount Everest is, of course. When I was young, kind of in my early, 20s, and I'd saved up loads of money. I lived in Canada. And I thought, what shall I do? I thought, okay, I'll go and found an ashram. Where shall I do it? I thought, why not on Mount Everest? So I looked on the maps, and I looked like, where could you go? Where's the nearest you could get to Mount Everest? And like, found an ashram. Were there any there? Buddhist, Tibetan type things. And I did some serious research on it, and I thought about it for a while. And I had this vision of, couldn't we get all the ashrams of the world, spiritual retreat centers, sort of interconnected? So you could be in the ashram in the Himalayas, and you could talk to somebody in one in the Amazon jungle, or in Cameroon, Africa, or in the Gaelic world of, Scotland and Ireland, and so on and so on. I thought we could link all these ashrams around and then get the wisdom people of the world speaking to each other and bring world peace. That was the vision. And what's interesting, that was in about 1981, I was thinking like that. And of course that was way before the internet. We're now in a place where we could do that. And we're sort of slowly doing it, aren't we? With the internet, and bless our Californian friends who've invented the internet, and Sir Tim Berners-Lee, thank you very much, Tim. They're sort of networked it all. However, it's not quite what I hoped for, in that it hasn't led to the ending of wars. Part of that vision I had in the early 80s was just by networking the wisdom people of the world, that would automatically create a sort of a noetic, interconnected sphere across the earth that would then lead automatically to the ending of war, violence, hatred and ignorance. But there's something else. There seems to be another force that the more you tell people this, the more they get angry. I've coined the phrase Sophiophobia. It's a sort of hatred of wisdom. People don't want to know about interconnectedness. They say, oh, it's a global conspiracy, it's the Illuminati, let's blow them up. And there's this counterforce, Sophiophobia kicks in. It's all the Jews doing it, we've got to destroy them. No, it's the Muslims, we hate them, etc. So, we're not home and dry yet, is what I'm saying. I think there's still, that vision is still valid. If anyone wants to set up some ashrams around the world and interlink them all, please let me know, and I'm happy to. Essentially, that's what I'm running here in the middle of France, in the rural heartland of Old Gaul. This is the sort of European peace ashram. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and to my faithful friends. So what have I'll just start by saying a bit about what I've been up to this week. And then we'll go into the next bit. So it's been a busy, full-on week. I was supposed to be in Paris for this World Congress of Freemasons, discussing the history of Freemasonry in the last 200 years. A bunch of people coming in from America, academics, these are historians, who, like me, have studied in depth the history of fraternal associations, they call it. And it's a bunch of people, both in Britain and America, and my colleague Andrew Prescott, who ran Centre for Historical Research into Freemasonry in the University of Sheffield. He was giving a talk. Other people. I got interested in this through the work of Professor Nicholas Hans, who was a great Russian historian who managed to get out from Russia at the time of the Bolsheviks. He was escaped on a battleship from Odessa by a British Navy ship. And he ended up a professor of the history of education at the University of London. He was a genius. I never met him. But he wrote an essay in the American Philosophical Association, which was founded by Thomas Jefferson. It's based in Philadelphia. I'd love to go to its library one day. It's the oldest learned society in America. And Nicholas was, I think, a corresponding member. He published this article in their journal on the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which was this Freemasonic network. And he called it the UNESCO of the 18th century, because basically it was a network for all the great thinkers, intellectuals of the time. Benjamin Franklin was its Grand Master when he was in Paris. And all the kind of, the advanced scientists and so on. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Freemasonry in detail. Anyway, I just thought it would have been fun to go to their meeting in Paris. But unfortunately I had another meeting which clashed with it, and I wasn't able to get there. But I hope the conference went really well. The other thing I want to report is I found a very interesting program on Netflix, which is an endless source of interesting documentaries and films and so on, about the Chinese emperor. A few weeks ago we had the Legalists, the founder of the Chinese Empire, who united it, and he buried alive some 400 Confucian scholars. He really didn't like rivals to his throne. And because they were intellectuals and they had theories about government and good government, he thought they were a threat to his absolute sovereignty and power. Well, what was so interesting, this documentary on Netflix is about the archaeology of that site. They've discovered his mausoleum in a part of China, and he buried along with himself hundreds and hundreds of terracotta guardians, warriors, bowmen, all kind of very carefully crafted. Their faces are beautifully made, their weapons, their armour and so on. Hundreds and hundreds, I think thousands of these things have been discovered by archaeologists. The documentary goes into the history of the discovery. It was randomly farmers in a field found a piece in 1974. They've been excavating away ever since. And what's so interesting about the documentary, the work isn't finished because the Chinese archaeologists have made a decision not to open the actual mausoleum where the emperor himself is. They're excavating around the site. He built an artificial pyramid over his actual mausoleum, and as yet they haven't dared to go into it. There's a debate going on in the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese intellectual circles that run archaeology in China. Should they open it or shouldn't they? They're saying their techniques aren't advanced enough yet. If they open it up, it might crumble into dust. They're trying to perfect their techniques. I also think there might be an element of, it's thought he's buried with thousands and thousands of human sacrifices, people he took to death with him. And I think they might be a little bit afraid to expose this to the world, the sheer bestiality and brutality of this emperor. He had 700,000 slaves working on this mausoleum site. And he was a very cruel man. He went crazy in the end, and it's documented in this documentary. He killed people and imprisoned them on the slightest pretense. And he reminds me of Stalin. I mean, he's like Stalin in his worst days, this guy. And so killing all these Confucian philosophers and scholars was just more typical behaviour. But what's so interesting about the documentary is that the minute he died, his ministers and sons started vying for position. There were two ministers who who then had the eldest son killed off. The eldest son was supposed to inherit this vast power, but they had him killed off. And they promoted a younger son who they could control. But then those two ministers fell out. One murdered the other, and then murdered the reigning emperor, who was the son. And then there was a rebellion. And an army of malcontents, discontents that had been brewing against this cruel emperor then attacked, besieged, captured the capital, and smashed a lot of the terracotta army. Some of the people that did it had been slaves working to build it. And in revenge, they smashed them. So the archaeologists exploring the site really are discovering a crime scene. So, and this all happened within, 10 or 20 years of the death of this crazy emperor. So I think there's a moral here, which is don't be a Stalin. Your empire crumbles into sand. And don't be a Mao, because the same megalomania and cruelty was part of Mao Zedong's character. So I think, and Putin likewise is showing traces of this stuff. So I think people should watch this documentary and learn from this crazy Chinese madman, emperor, who was utterly power mad and who couldn't stand people talking and thinking and having opinions and, having a life. So that's something that I've been studying that's very interesting. Yes, I think we can learn from, that's why we study history. We learn from the mistakes of the past and then we don't repeat them. That's the theory. I'm also, meanwhile, in another part of the forest, studying Josephus's history of the Jewish people, all their incredible complexity and a lot of wars and it's a nightmare in the Middle East. They happen to be active in a very burned over district of world history, which had conquerors coming and going, and so it's a bit of a nightmare, that whole thing. And that, I think, is why Jesus was born there, because he was born at the fulcrum of that conflict and violence, and yet preaching a path of peace and universal reason, if you want, the logos within us all. And then I'm also studying Livy's History of Rome in another part of the forest. I have different books I'm reading simultaneously in different rooms here in the Maison des Muses. And Livy is fascinating too, and I love his historical writing. He wrote the biggest book on the history of Rome ever. And I've got up to, he's talking about Numa Pompilius, who was the greatest Roman king before the empire. And he was very pious, religious. He founded Roman religion. And he insisted on rituals, ceremonies for each day of the year, keeping people busy, because he was trying to stop their martial habits. He was a Sabine who was given the kingship because they honoured him. And he said, I'll only do it if you stop being so warlike, because the Romans already had a reputation for violence. And they accepted those terms. And so he created Roman Religio in order to impress upon the Roman people that it's much more important to choose a spiritual or religious path than to pursue war, on the horizontal path. So he was a wise ruler, unlike this Chinese emperor. Meanwhile, I've also been active helping my Druid colleagues to plan a Poets' Corner at Stonehenge. We have the summer solstice event coming up at Stonehenge. Friends and colleagues will come there from all over Britain and the world. And we're organising a little Poets' Corner. So this is with my Poets to Peace hat on. I run a peace order for Druids, bards and poets, and hopefully friends will gather and go and read their works. It's important to keep the flame of poetry alive. Yes, and also I'm planning the Mary Magdalene Studies Association event this week and next week, and it's coming up on the 22nd of July. It'll be partly here and partly on Zoom. And I do this every week for people that are interested in Mary Magdalene. Who was she historically? What does she stand for? What does she represent? Was she the consort or Gnostic disciple of Christ? What's her gospel? And I'm listening to a very, very brilliant book by my friend Sophie Strand, who gave a talk for us last year. She's written, many interesting and profound books, and one of them is a fantastic novel called The Madonna Secret, published just last year, which I'm listening to. And I think to me, it's one of the best, historical fictions reconstructing Mary Magdalene's life story. She has her in the south of France, there's quite a lot of evidence that she did actually end up there. And she has Luke, the author of Luke's Gospel, coming on pilgrimage to meet her and interviewing her about her life story and her story and relationship with Jesus. And the novel is her telling what really happened to Luke. It's brilliantly done. I recommend it. And unfortunately, Sophie won't be talking this year at the Mary Magdalene Studies Association event because she herself is not well. She's got a serious illness, and I'm really sad for Sophie. I hope she recovers. I don't know what it is, and I hope, she's very young. Please don't go and depart, Sophie. We need your brilliant mind and heart. She was a student at Bard College, American, brilliant writer. And as I said, I've also been working on my dictionary of peace words, 99 different languages I'm looking at in this book. And I've been working this week on Sumerian, which is absolutely fascinating. I love the Sumerian language, and there's some good dictionaries around. People have finally begun to crack Sumerian, and I'm a great fan of the Sumerian pantheon, as you know. But it's such a fascinating language. What was it? Where did it come from? And what's the origin? So I've been researching all that, and then I've moved on to Nepali, from the Himalayan kingdom of Nepal, and studying that language. And that's fascinating too, discovering many secrets about the Nepali language, which is quite a new language. It's related to Sanskrit and Hindi and Urdu and all these other Indo-Aryan languages, as they're called. But the Nepali kingdom really only began in like the 1600s to consolidate politically, and found this thing called Nepal. And the first literature really developed only in the 1800s, even the 19th century. And I've discovered a brilliant poet who translated the Ramayana into Nepali, which is like their great epic. And this got everybody reading Nepali. He was an amazing guy who he wrote that. He also was then imprisoned under false charges in a prison in Kathmandu, I think. And he was forgotten about, left there for a few years. And he wrote an appeal to the Prime Minister in Nepalese, like in poetry, protesting, saying, no, I'm innocent, I didn't do this, I've written a thing of the Ramayana, how can you do this to me? And it was so successful that the Prime Minister immediately let him out and gave him like a pension and honour and all that. So that's an interesting story about how poetry can get you out of prison. And so then that led me, I've discovered another brilliant intellectual in Nepal in the early 20th century called Jaya Prithvi Bahadur Singh, who I'd not heard of before, I apologise, he was from the aristocratic families that ran Nepal, but he was so appalled at World War One, in which 200,000 Nepali Gurkhas were conscripted, and many of them died. They fought for the British Army. He was so appalled at World War One that he gave up his power. He was a sort of, an educational official in the government, and launched a humanistic club. And he went to Bangalore to do it in the south of India. And he became a sort of freelance intellectual trying to stop wars, a peace activist. He gave talks in Japan, in Germany, in Paris. He went to the League of Nations in Geneva. And he was saying we can't go on doing these wars anymore. We have to outthink them. And he was like a single one-handed UNESCO trying to find a way to reconcile all the ideologies of the time. He said, no, fascism's no good, that won't do. Communism won't do, that's ridiculous. We need to think through a way that ordinary people can relate to and yet is robust enough to stand the criticism of the greatest thinkers. Anyway, this guy was a genius, and he wrote a book on humanism, because he said the solution is humanism, by which he meant, he gave it a new definition in his Nepali mindset. He meant life-affirming, human-centered, intellectual path that accommodates all the faith paths, but it doesn't have the label of any one of them. It has all of them, and it's on the side of humanity as a whole. I think he was about 100 years ahead of his time, this guy, so honour to him. And it's great that Nepal regards him now as one of the founders, the leading intellectuals of their new nation, really. Unfortunately, the British didn't see it like that. We thought he was a Japanese spy, so we put him under house arrest in World War II, because he had been to Japan and he loved Japan. He certainly wasn't a spy, I mean, that's absurd. And he died in 1940 under house arrest, which is tragic. But, scholars are now rediscovering him and publishing learned articles about him. So, yeah, Nepal is definitely... I've actually, in my piecework in India with the Jains, I've been to conferences there many times, and they often have had a delegation of people coming from Nepal. The last conference in 2019 in Delhi, we had about 10 people from Nepal, many of whom were MPs from the government, had come on a mission for peace. They're inspiring people. And of course, you all know the tragedy of the monarch is no more. There's no monarchy in Nepal left, because one of the princes killed his mother and father, the king and queen, not that long ago, and just slaughtered them, shot them, because they were saying he couldn't marry the woman he wanted to marry, so he got a gun and he killed brothers and sisters, and it was a massacre. I think it's ironic that poor old Buddha, who was from Nepal, said cause of suffering is desire, frustration, wrong desire. It's a perfect illustration. The woman he wanted to marry, who was also an aristocrat, wasn't quite aristocratic enough for the mother, because her great-grandmother had been a courtesan, a commoner, and so the mother said, no, you can't marry her. She's not a good enough blue blood for you. But the poor chap loved her, and so because the parents said no, he just shot everyone. Well, that's an example of why Buddha's teachings are still relevant. Don't ever do that extreme desire so much that it goes over and turns into its opposite and becomes hatred and cruelty and so on. I suppose it's the same with the Chinese emperor. He loved power so much, he had so much attachment to his power that he was prepared to kill other people to keep it. I'm also reading the biography of Lenin, as I promised myself, 500-page thing. I'm learning a lot about Lenin. It's very, very interesting, and I, of course, studied all this for my degree, and my mother was some kind of a Marxist, but she never knew anything about the details of all this stuff. I'm going into it with the forensic detail. And what I've discovered about Lenin is how one-sided and one-minded he was. Very early on, he decided Marx was the truth. Nothing else mattered. He became a scholar in the Marxist tradition. He published a book called The History of Capitalism in Russia when he was in exile. Exile in Siberia for him was just a chance to do lots of scholarship. He had books sent to him on the train from Petersburg, and he was corresponding with Marxists all over Russia and all over Europe. And he was very happy living in exile. You get a little pension from the then Russian government, and they left you alone. Totally different to Stalin's exile, because he worked people to death in the camps, especially in Kolyma, where thousands and thousands died. Lenin had an easy life. But he became totally obsessed with the Marxist analysis of events and of history. But it was focused through this lens of hatred and revenge. It's very, very easy actually to hate and to want revenge. You can be really focused on it, obsessively so. It's much more difficult to love, because love is more diffuse. It requires an openness to reality, whereas hate is about closure. I want the Romanov dynasty destroyed. That was his master thought, and he saw Marxism as a way to do it, because he could then galvanize support from the masses, the workers. His version of Marxism wasn't Marxism at all, as Kautsky, who was a friend of Engels and a genuine Marxist intellectual in Austria, pointed out. What Lenin did was, he was an agrarian terrorist socialist using violence, like his hero Chernyshevsky and others. These were not Marxists at all. Marx didn't agree with that stuff. He wanted the wheels of history to turn round so that history will make a progress through capitalism to socialism to communism. But there's no point like trying to hasten that by doing mass killings. I mean, and when Kautsky saw what Lenin was doing, just massacring intellectuals, massacring everyone who didn't agree with him, he just wrote a book saying, this isn't Marxism. This is nothing. This is terrorism gone mad. So anyway, I'm studying all the details of that, because I think one has a moral duty as a historian to try and understand where history went wrong. Putin is like the after, the sort of afterglow of that nightmare that Stalin gave us. And until we can understand at core what the cause of it was and remedy it, how do we remedy it? Okay, so I, as a kind of Meta-Mahayana Buddhist esotericist druid, I have my own meditational techniques that I use, which people are welcome to join in. And I'm happy to talk about that with people. But basically, what you do is you put yourself in the position of that, and then you bring redemption into that position retrospectively. So you become Lenin mentally, and you then make amends, you apologize, you say to the gods, God, what a horrible person I was, what an idiot. Why didn't I just see things from another perspective? And so you allow some light or emptiness into the closure of the fixed system. And you can do that through meditational visualization, which is what Mahayana Buddhism is all about. And it's not. It doesn't belong to it's not just Buddhist in the narrow sense. It's something that advanced Christian meditators do, Sufis do. In the Kabbalah, this visualization has been taken to a high level. So it's an ecumenical tool for redeeming even the past. Because if, like me, you believe that in some sense all time is present, if you do that redemptive work even to the past, I don't know how it works. I haven't written the metaphysics out yet, but I know it does affect the present and indeed the future, because it's human souls that have done all these terrible things, these crimes, and they're the ones that need redeeming. And they're still around, they're in some hell world somewhere. And it's to redeem them that this work is done. That was so when Christians say Christ harrowed hell, that's what he was doing. He was going into this realm of evil to redeem it back to the light. And that's what we should be doing, I think, as spiritual warriors of the light. So I've also this week been studying a fantastic DVD, which apparently is a book about trees, how trees intercommunicate. This is a bunch of French ecologists and forestiers as they're called, and they've studied in depth how trees intercommunicate, and that this is why in a forest you should plant many species together, because the diversity of trees intercommunicate and they share information, nourishment across species. So they make families of trees, and that's how forests are healthy. There's an amazing ecologist in the University of British Columbia who studied all this, and she's done detailed, she did a PhD on it, she's done detailed testing with sort of isotopes that you can track in the soil going from one tree to the next. And the cedars love the pines, they love all different varieties working together. And that makes for a healthy forest, because if one of them gets immune to a particular insect or disease, they share that immunity with all the other trees in the forest. And because they're all slightly different, they cultivate different types of immunities. Now that's very interesting, but up until recently, forest people used to plant monoculture. So in parts of Scotland, you'll see vast acres of just pine trees or firs or whatever. That's not so healthy for the trees, because if one of them gets sick, they all get sick. They don't have that shared immunity and resilience. So this is quite a transformation among intellectual ecologists studying how trees actually can communicate across the through their root systems. It's fascinating. I recommend it to people. And apparently there's a book. I imagine it must be in English as well as French. Email me if you want the details. It seems to me the French have been way ahead on this for a while. And yes, a lot of France is forest still, as is revealed in this film. When I drove here to the middle of France, I was amazed how rural, how forested it is on the journey from Dieppe. In Britain, every few miles there's a village or a town or a city. It's much more densely packed until you get up to Scotland, which is why I like Scotland so much. So, yes, it's been a busy week, and just to finish off before we start the philosophy game, so to speak, Gaza, yes, Gaza, it hasn't gone away. We seem to be lumbering slowly towards a kind of ceasefire. The Israelis released 4 hostages in a daring raid, but they killed 300. I mean, like what? It just doesn't seem. The ethics of that don't add up to me. Why can't they just agree the ceasefire, get all the hostages released, and start talking to each other? One of the most important Nepali words for peace is related to mela, coming together, mila. And it's the root of the word Kumbh Mela in Sanskrit, the greatest gathering of gurus, sages and rishis on the planet. It takes place every few years, moves around location, and millions of people come. It's a mela. And mela means a meeting, a coming together, a togetherness, a talking to each other, a being together. And it's the same root for the word for peace in Nepali. What we need is a big meeting, a coming together of Palestinians and Israelis and all their neighbours, Lebanese, Syrians. These are all amazing people. I love them. Egyptians. Surely, if we have a mela, we come together, we can bring peace here. But anyway, there's a brilliant talk I've been listening to by Max Blumenthal and Ilan Pappé, Palestinian historian and a Jewish American intellectual, about the deep roots of this conflict. And they're going back to the 19th century. Max Blumenthal talks about early period of Zionism and how, quite early on it was not prepared to make peace deals